Make the ground shake.
Cheater amps. We have all heard of them. We all have an idea in our head of what they are. Today I'm going to give you my take on the history of cheater amps. I would just like to reiterate that this is just my opinion and that most of my information was gathered from magazine articles and directories, as well as my own personal experiences. So with that being said, let's get on with it. To explore the history of the cheater amps, we must first understand why cheater amps existed. In the mid-80s through the mid-late 90s, most car audio competitions were divided into classes that were determined by the manufacturer's forum stereo rating. The divisions varied between sanctioning bodies, but generally they went something like this: 0 to 50 watts, 51 to 100 watts, 101 to 200 watts. Now this is just an example and could vary wildly depending on the years you competed or the sanctioning body you competed with. This is what led to the invention of the cheater amp and made the lower power classes very competitive. Now that you have an idea of why cheater amps came about, I'm going to tell you a little bit of why they were considered cheaters. Most amps before cheater amps were made using a high voltage design. These amps made their power at forums stereo and forums mono. But cheater amps generally use a high current design. Now I say generally because there is another type of cheater, but I will get into this a little later. For now, let's talk about the late 80s. In particular, let's talk about 1987 and a little company named Orion. In my opinion, cheater amps started and ended with Orion because in 1987 they introduced the Orion 225 Hcca. The Hcca stood for High Current Competition Amplifier. This amp was rated 25 watts by 2 at forum stereo and started to make real power as you dropped the impedance. In fact, it was rated to 1/2 ohm stereo and 1 ohm mono, where it would do about 400 watts. Now this amp was designed to double its power every time you step down the impedance. So 25 watts by 2 at 4 ohms, 50 watts by 2 at 2 ohms, 100 watts by 2 at 1 ohm, and 200 watts by 2 at 1/2 ohm. Many companies followed this formula and produced their own cheaters, including but not limited to Hcca, PPI, Soundstream, and Phoenix Gold. So far I've just mentioned amps that would be the 0 to 50 watt power class, but there were cheaters in almost every size ranging from 25 watts by 2 at 4 ohms to 100 watts by 2 at 4 ohms. And as I mentioned before, there is another type of cheater. That would be the severely underrated cheater. This could still be a high current design, or it could be a high voltage design. I'm going to give you two examples in the 0 to 50 watt power class. The first example is the Rockford Fosgate Punch 45 HD. This amp was a high voltage design and was rated 22.5 watts by 2 at 4 ohm stereo, 35 watts by 2 at 2 ohm stereo, and 70 watts bridged at 4 ohms. Even though this amp was not rated at 2 ohm mono, it was tough as nails and could handle the load, and was capable of putting out much more at that impedance. To give you an idea of what these amps were capable of in the real world, I'm including a link to BigDWiz Punch 45 HD amp dyno run. You should check it out. Okay, now for the next example, the Earthquake 40 UHC. This amp was rated 40 watts by 1 at 4 ohm mono, 600 watts by 1 at 2 ohm mono, and 1200 watts by 1 at 1 ohm mono. As you can see, the math really doesn't work out on this amp. This link will take you to BigDWiz video where you can see that this amp really makes closer to 350 watts at 4 ohms mono. This amp would be in the same class as any other 50 watt amp and is a prime example of the manufacturers fudging the numbers for the sake of competition. This wasn't the only amp to do this. In fact, US Amps and a few other companies were known to switch amp boards into cheater amp chassis for competition. With all these amp ratings getting out of hand, Orion decided to make a statement, and that statement was Orion Concept 97.3. This amp was rated at 1/2 watt per channel at 4 ohm stereo, and it was essentially just a 225 beast in a polished chassis, and it was actually capable of around 1,000 watts. This amp was a tipping point for the sanctioning bodies and brought about some changes in competition divisions. Most divisions were changed to speaker cone area or the clamped amp power classes and are mostly the same way today. Cheater amps always bring me back to the glory days of competing in the 90s. It was a great time in car audio history, and it is the reason why I'm making these videos, to help bring a little bit of nostalgia back to you guys. If you guys like this video, let me know in the comments. Also, like, subscribe, check out my other videos, and hit me up on Facebook.com/HifiVega and Twitter.com/HifiVega.